Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Back in the year 2000, the government wanted an identification project, and he was sent off to Israel and China to study how the authorities work with prison populations. And he designed this thing. And I said, well, who commissioned this whole thing? Who wanted to design this? And he said, L.K. Advani. And when he said that, I must admit my jaw just dropped. Because L.K. Advani, for me, I was growing up when 1992 happened, and he represented something. He represented a certain strain in Indian society, which I had always felt was very unpleasant growing up. And from there on, it was all about reaching into the past, understanding why L.K. Advani wanted an identification project, whether this identification project was actually a precursor to Aadhaar, or whether it had evolved and become Aadhaar.
In 2018, Rahul Bhatia left his job as an investigative reporter to understand the necessity of the Aadhaar project. As he explored its roots, questions about citizenship and belonging began to grow louder in public life, culminating in extreme violence in New Delhi. Against this backdrop, he discovered that India's technological identity project was linked to a cultural identity project over a century old. These investigations culminated in the Identity Project, a journey through the slow burn of Indian democracy and a record that connects the past and the present to offer the first thorough account of how cultural imperatives are guiding the country's direction. In discussion with editor and journalist Prem Panikar, Rahul will delve into his research as he investigates the history of disinformation in India and looks at how justice works in the aftermath of riots. What emerges is a timely portrait of a country struggling to define its identity. This episode was adapted from an event that took place at the Bangalore International Centre in October 2024.
So I'll tell you a little about the book, the shape of it, and what it actually contains. It's a book in 5 parts. The first begins with me actually wondering where hatred has come from, because like many people are familiar with, families began to change and say things differently. And there was this edge of anger to discussions between family members, and it was targeted at Muslims and everything. And like many people, I was also wondering about it. And I sort of used that moment to, or rather this particular change that takes place in society and within our families, to get into the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2020, which is really where the book kicks off. And I try and sort of show you how it came about, what the response to it was like, the protests at Jamia and other universities across North India, and what happened in the aftermath. In fact, the pushback, the what people call riots, but which were, this was actually targeted violence. And so I started building a picture of how this violence unfolded and what it did to people on the ground. I did this by talking to dozens of people who were affected by the violence, and I tracked them for a while. I kept going back, meeting them, asking them questions, and I follow some of them through the courts. I see how the justice system works for them, and I find them, and when I say them, I mean a lot of Muslim men in particular, wondering about their place in India, and they're wondering why there is this hatred and where it's actually coming from. The second part of the book is where it's a historical deep dive into where the hatred might be coming from. I'm a journalist and not a historian. So the way I worked it was essentially investigating the archives, or at least what I thought was investigating the archives. I sort of went into archives that were on, I think, 4 continents at least, and tried to build a picture of how hate, probably as we know it, the modern form of it, actually may have emerged in the middle of the 19th century, and how it evolved, how it affected us all through the 20th century, especially during partition, and how it leads up to today. The third section of the book is where I speak to people who were part of the RSS, and I go visit shakhas, and I try and understand what exactly is going on in people's minds as they attend these shakhas, if they've been a part of the RSS for a long time. Um, what swayed them? Why did they leave? How does it work on the inside? So these were sort of technical questions that I was trying to understand, because I felt it would explain why people thought a certain way. And from there, the book actually takes a rather dramatic turn where I talk about the actual identity project that we've been living with, which is called Aadhaar in India. And I show the connections between right wing ideology and Aadhaar, or a plan that looked very much like Aadhaar, which then evolved within government and seems to have become Aadhaar today. That leads to the fifth section, where I close out the book by interviewing people who are with the RSS. I interview people who, or rather, a character that I've been following for much of the first part of the book, a man whose life has been completely upended by the riots and who is the closest that I have to a moral center in the book. He's the main character in the book itself. And through him, I start to sort of explain how we actually remember events, this despair that he feels. I try and interrogate it a little more. I try and interrogate how he remembers his life as a child. And we take a little trip to his village. It closes out on that quiet note. But I think between the five, at least for myself, it was a real journey, because I think over those 5 sections, I started to understand this country a little better. And that's what's in the book.
In your introduction to the book, and I wanted to quote something that you'd written, you introduce your book as an investigative memoir, an attempt to see the roots of Hindutva, the unbending ideology of Hindu extremism. It made me think, when I was reading that for the first time, I thought of a chat we had on the phone, I think 5 or 6 months after you quit your job as an investigative journalist for Reuters. When I asked what you were up to, you said you wanted to dive deep into Aadhaar. And if I remember that conversation correctly, you said it was not the technology underlying Aadhaar that you were focused on or interested in. It was more how this was affecting the relationship between the state and the citizen. So that was kind of, for all those years that you were working on it, that was kind of my expectation. And then the book that I actually got was radically different. Aadhaar is a part of it, but its beating heart is something else. I was wondering how that pivot happened. When did you, at what point in your research into Aadhaar did you suddenly see a bigger picture, a bigger canvas that you wanted to explore?
So, for about 3 or 4 years, I approached it like it was a book about Aadhaar. So I read all the literature, I read all the books that had been written about it. I went and found technical documents, rather, I was given technical documents to look at. And there was a group of activists who essentially had done the work of putting together everything that had ever been published on Aadhaar, the technical specifications, as well as critiques, as well as legal briefs. There was a Supreme Court case going on at around the same time. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of documents over there. And I collected everything and I tried to read as much as I could. But I'm somebody who, when I write, I like writing about people, because I think people bring stories alive. And as I was reading these documents, I had this feeling that that was not where the story was. At the same time, I had looked at how Aadhaar had led to starvation deaths in Jharkhand. And when I went out there and spoke to this young boy, he must have been about 10 or 11, and his mother had just died a few months before. And he was all by himself in a house that contained, it was a mud hut that contained nothing. In fact, activists who went over there later spoke to me and they said they'd never seen a place that bereft of possessions before. There was maybe some salt, but there wasn't a single possession. To sort of put it in perspective, the thing that was worth the most in that house itself was either the light bulb hanging from the ceiling or the stack of logs that had been left over from the funeral pyre a few months ago. And when I spoke to people over there, neighbors, relatives, they had this story of how this woman had died of hunger. And a day or two later, the authority, the identification authority came in, they did a very quick autopsy, they found certain residue in her stomach, and they said, well, she couldn't have died of hunger because there was something over there. And they went on their way. There was a neighbor who was arrested for some kind of fraud. I mean, it felt, as a journalist, when you sort of enter these places and people tell you about how police have picked up somebody randomly without reasons, or a very quick procedure has happened, like a governmental procedure, or something has happened that has left everybody wondering what's going on, you know that there is a larger story over here which is unexplained. And so, as I was talking to people over there, I got the sense that what I am told that Aadhaar is, or rather, what we are told that Aadhaar is there for welfare and that it works and that the failure rate is minuscule, all of those things, I started thinking about them. I asked them, if it goes wrong for you, and these were people who get rations, so they had to put their thumb down and get that thing to work for them. I asked, if it doesn't work for you, what do you do? And one of them told me, well, earlier we just used to go to the mukhya or the village head or somebody, and we would tell them and they would fix it for us. But now we really don't know who to go to, who to complain to. And a thought occurred to me like, okay, it's like customer service. You don't really know who to go to anymore with all this technology around you. So as I wrote the piece for the New Yorker, and then after that, I started thinking about it. There was a case going on in the courts. People were saying it was an exclusionary tool. It could be used for surveillance. And as I was looking at all these things, I just thought something fundamental is changing over here. Something has changed fundamentally in the relationship between states and the citizens. And citizens really don't know who to talk to, which is a pretty fundamental change if you think about it. And so I started looking at that and kept asking questions that were not technical anymore, but about people's concerns. I asked them, you're thinking about it in terms of surveillance. Why? And they would tell me something. Somebody else would tell me about hunger. Somebody would tell me that their children were not allowed to go to school if they didn't show an Aadhaar card, or they weren't allowed to give an exam if they didn't give their Aadhaar number. I heard of a lawyer, a Supreme Court lawyer, who absolutely blew up in court when he explained that the school was demanding his child's Aadhaar number. And when I heard all of these things, it was just this mix of reactions and my own understanding of it. And it just felt like what I had been told was very different from what was actually happening on the ground. And so I began looking at it that way. And at a certain point, the question became, why is this so necessary? Because there were opponents to Aadhaar. And these were people I knew of. And when I spoke to them, they told me things like, well, yes, we're being surveilled, we're being targeted in certain ways. I heard about organizations, one organization in Bangalore whose funders were called up and apparently, allegedly told, don't fund the organization. And the funding for this organization dried up completely after they did a report that showed over 100 million people's Aadhaar numbers and identification was essentially compromised. And so when all of these things happened, the question was, why is there this need, this pressing need to push technology, and critics of it are being told, be quiet? So when I went searching for that question, like, why is it necessary? Where did it come from? That led me to, I made a little discovery actually. I heard about an earlier identification project back in the year 2000. It had been designed and it was called Nishan. And I read the story. I saw that there was a name over there, name of a man who stood by the plan. He had apparently planned it. And I looked him up online. And it turned out that I found his number within a few minutes. He was in Delhi. He was selling wrought iron wood stoves. And I called him up and I said, are you the guy in this story? And he says, oh, yeah, that was me, different life. So I said, can I come and see you? And he says, sure, when? I said, like tomorrow. I'll get on a flight right now and come over to Delhi. So we met a couple of days later, and we met at his really lovely residence somewhere in central Delhi. And he had this large lawn, and in one corner of the lawn was his office, glass front. So I think on one side over here, Mussolini ashtray in the bathroom. And there were these stoves all around us, which he would transport to villages in the mountains where people had their second homes and where they went up for, for their retreats. And between all of these things, he told me a spectacular story about how back in the year 2000, the government wanted an identification project. And he was sent off to Israel and China to study how the authorities work with prison populations. And he designed this thing. And I said, well, who along the way, I asked him, who commissioned this whole thing? Who wanted to design this? And he said, L.K. Advani. And when he said that, I must admit, my jaw just dropped. I think in my head, my jaw dropped. And because L.K. Advani for me, as a, I was growing up when 1992 happened, and he represented something. He represented a certain strain in Indian society, which I had always felt was very unpleasant growing up. But I didn't really know much more about him because I wasn't a political journalist. And from there on, it was all about reaching into the past, understanding why L.K. Advani wanted an identification project, whether this identification project was actually a precursor to Aadhaar or whether it had evolved and become Aadhaar. And at the other end, go back in time and try and understand the ideology that brought us to this point where L.K. Advani thought, this is great to find infiltrators. And, infiltrators essentially means only one thing. So the book expanded, it went back in time, and along the way, CAA, NRC, these protests were happening. And I just thought, I've got to go there. I had no idea of the structure of this whole thing. It was still Aadhaar, but it also now felt, after Advani's name came into the picture, I felt like I had to sort of examine communalism. And I'm a reporter without a job, without anything. So I'm scrounging together funds, going to Delhi over and over again, meeting people in Northeast Delhi where the violence happened. And I'm trying to understand what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. And at a certain point, both these things, they just sort of came together. These threads, they came together because there were people on the ground saying, we don't know where the hatred is coming from. And here was a figure who for me represented an extreme hatred. And he had somehow found himself I somehow found him in the middle of my book. And so it was about examining these things. So it went from being about Aadhaar to being about much more than Aadhaar.
I want to get back to Advani and Aadhaar a little while later. But before that, you said you reached back into the past. The fact that Advani, the whole identity project originated in Advani's mind was kind of an eye-opener for me. And I thought I was a political journalist. But more to the point, one of the first startling moments for me was, and this goes to where you speak about reaching back into the past, it made me think of the elisions of history as it's taught in our schools. Dayanand Saraswati and the Arya Samaj. You trace the roots of contemporary India and some of the fault lines of contemporary India all the way back to the 19th century. The way we are taught, Dayanand Saraswati is a reformer. He was against child marriage. He was for widow remarriage. He advocated a sort of relook at how the caste system functions, all of which are absolutely benign and much wanted reforms. In fact, he is portrayed as a social reformer. But after reading your book, I also realized that, for instance, his notions on crime and punishment. A woman who allegedly indulged in adultery had to be torn apart by dogs. A man had to be fried on a metal, skillet or whatever. These are notions that date back to the Old Testament, to Leviticus. So that was one of the startling things. But what startled me even more was that the cow protection thing, the progenitor of today's Gaurakshaks was actually Dayanand Saraswati. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Everything was a surprise at a certain point. I didn't grow up in India, so I didn't study history over here, and I didn't have that memory that a lot of people do, or I didn't have certain ideas that were fixed in my head. I was approaching everything for the first time. And so I read everything. I mean, I read everything I could. I dug up documents from everywhere. Now, what had happened was, as I was looking at Advani, he was a member of the RSS. And so I wanted to understand the RSS. I have family members who are with the RSS, and they were, always slightly different in the way they thought about things. And so as I was looking at the RSS, I realized I didn't know how they work. I don't know how their bands of young men work. I don't know what their structure is like. I don't know what it is they do. It calls itself a social organization. Its members call themselves part of a social organization, and they're working towards a certain idea of India. But I wanted to understand more. And so I felt, the way to start looking at it was to look at reports in the aftermath of riots, fact finding reports, of which there are plenty. The organization's name would come up sometimes in passing, sometimes central to various events that were taking place across India. And it seemed to sort of stretch back in time. And then, of course, there was the big one, which is January 30th, 1948, where you have Godse. And it felt like something was happening there too. So as I was working backwards, I tried to dig up their mention in the archives wherever I found them. And like I said, 4 or 5 really large archives, downloaded everything I could, photocopied everything I could, scanned it all into a database, made it all, readable, and then just went looking and trying to piece together what I could find. And as that was happening, I realized that, okay, it seems pretty fully formed. There are cells of men, they go around, there's a sort of decentralized way in which they work. In 1947, 1946, as the police is going from place to place trying to find them, they seem to disappear really quickly. And I said, okay, this is something's happening over here. I don't understand how or why they work in the way they do and where they learned their tactics from. And that took me back to the Mahasabha. Pulling on that thread took me back to secret societies in Calcutta at the turn of the century, revolutionary societies like Anushilan Samiti, Jugantar, all of these. And there were some really detailed reports about how those organizations worked. Because it's part of RSS lore also. There was this, that it's part of RSS lore that Hedgever, the founder of the RSS, went to Calcutta and he sort of helped out over there, or he did something over there. He was a part of these revolutionary groups. So I wanted to understand the revolutionary groups, and more importantly, understand how they worked as these physical clubs where they learned to, they trained in lathi play, sword play, and all kinds of other stuff, how they had passwords, what their propaganda was like. And when I went through that literature, and there are some fine books written about it, but I was looking for particular themes about how these groups worked. It seemed like some of the stuff that I saw on WhatsApp today was there in a pamphlet form back at the turn of the century. And I thought that was really interesting. The tone, the way you convince people, the way you sow doubt. These were the sort of messages that I knew for a fact family members were getting on WhatsApp and I was being subject to on Twitter. Anybody who's been on Twitter knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's a kind of, you say something, somebody reacts to you with a certain what you'd call whataboutery, but which is rooted in, I felt, something that was deeply historical. So I wanted to understand that. And along the way, as I was researching all of these things, I saw that there was a connection to the Arya Samaj. And so I went back, saw the cow protection societies. Look, some of this stuff has been, I mean, a lot of this stuff has been written about, but seeing it from the perspective of organized cells of men and disinformation and core beliefs, the fact that India was a great civilization 5,000 years ago. We had all these great weapons, we had rockets, we had telephones, we had airplanes, all of that stuff. It seemed to have a certain origin with the Arya Samaj. And when I got to the Arya Samaj, I found myself thinking, okay, I've got to understand where this comes from. And I called up a historian. I remember that day. I called up a historian that day. and said, I explained the book. I started with Aadhaar. I'm here. Now I'm back in history. And I'm now with the Arya Samaj and Dayanand Saraswati. And she said, if you go back any further, you will go mad. Uh, and, uh, and so I just stopped. And luckily, Dayanand Saraswati was a really good place to begin, because you see at certain points in letters and literature that these administrators are writing to each other. They're talking about how his schools are filling young men's minds with all kinds of misinformation. And they don't use the word misinformation, but they say that these men are spreading rumors and false information. And this can have a destabilizing effect on society. And I thought that sounds a lot like my own lived experience right now. And that's where it began then.
To one of the points that Rahul brought up just now, recently there was somebody posted on Twitter, this was during the Ganesh Puja days, posted saying that maybe India should be building more mosques than temples. And his reasoning was that today, apparently, no Hindu festival can be celebrated without landing up in front of a mosque and making a ruckus. So we might as well build mosques in furtherance of our religion. You laugh initially when you see a post like that, but there is a point to that. And what I wanted to, so there's a statistic that you're probably familiar with. A 17-month period, 19-month period, there were 52 riots. 17 of those riots involved members of one community during a religious festival, landing up with their drums and their trumpets and stuff in front of the places of worship of another community. And riots follow. Over 200 people died. This seems familiar to all of you, right? It could have been earlier this year, it could have been last year. The period that I'm talking about is actually February 1926 to August 1927 when this happened. One of the things that strikes you when you read Rahul's book, in fact, while reading the book, I looked up a quotation that I was vaguely familiar with. I wanted to get the exact words. Eugene O'Neill, the American playwright, once wrote that there is no present or future. There is just the past repeating over and over and over again. That's one of the things that kept coming back to me while I was reading this, because Love Jihad starts in the 1920s, not with the BJP, but with the Hindu Mahasabha, with B.S. Munji. Pretty much all the jihads that you hear about today have their origins back then, pre-independence India. There are two things that I'm curious about, but mostly this. When these things started happening, when, say, the early 90s, the Rath Yatra, the violence that followed the Babri Masjid, the riots below that, the kind of performative bigotry that has become the norm today. When you have these conversations with people about, I think one of your characters, Nisar, I think, was the one who asked, where did this poison come from? And that's one of the pivotal moments in your narrative. You generally trace it back to the 90s, which first made me ask the question. I mean, like I said, I didn't realize that it went back to the 19th century. But more to the point, why do you think that in the post-independence phase, all of this was submerged? We didn't really have this kind of thing. I mean, I grew up in a joint family. My father was part of the RSS at one point, but open expressions of communalism were frowned upon. In fact, if somebody did that, they got kicked out of the house. So what was that period like when this was not a preoccupation, or at least it was not an overt preoccupation? How did that come about, and how did we shift again?
So I think when you look at 1946, 1947, and you look at police reports, intelligence reports from that time, both from India and from Pakistan, you find the names of various groups, the Mahasabha, the RSS, groups in Punjab, popping up as agents of violence. There are reports, about bombs and poison-tipped arrows and catapults and printing presses that were publishing really horrific propaganda, the sort of thing that would make a person's blood boil at that point when there's violence all around them, which is communal in nature. And then you see at that point Nehru in his letters struggling to contain it. He's convinced that the violence around him that he's seeing after 1947, especially in Delhi in September 1947, is organized. He comes out and says it at one of his meetings. There are minutes of that meeting where he says, I have no doubt this violence is organized. And for him, it's top of his mind is groups like the RSS and the Mahasabha. In fact, he mentions them over and over again as communal bodies that will take India in the opposite direction to Pakistan, but not in the way they think. They will create a kind of Pakistan within India itself. And that's his fear. At the same time, he's grappling with a law enforcement machinery that on the ground is refusing to follow orders. So he's telling them, shoot to kill and keep order. But these people are shooting above the heads of rioters. There are rioters going around to various police stations telling them, don't attack us in this disturbance. We are identifiable by white kerchiefs around our wrists. So you see all of this, and they were certainly very active at that point. Then comes January 30th, 1948. And what you see in the aftermath is this outpouring of anger against them. They're targeted. It becomes, I think people in the institutional memory of the RSS, from my conversations with people, it seems like they remember it as a very traumatic time. Even though they didn't experience it, that institutional memory has sort of passed on to them. And they talk about it like those were the darkest of days. They sort of go underground in some ways, but Nehru and many others are aware of the fact that in other parts of India, in certain parts of India, there's a great deal of popularity for them. They visit places, and I think they're met with open arms and giant crowds wherever they go. So there's this mixture of sort of going underground, but also being present in some ways. That's when you also see the political arm emerge, because they see it as necessary to their survival. And so I'm not sure why they go quiet, apart from the fact that it's the assassination that makes them at some level, at one level, among a large part of the population, deeply unacceptable. And you see that, I spoke to people who had joined the RSS as children. It was interesting. They had one parent who was okay with them sort of joining, but at the same time, there was this, how would you say, they believed very firmly, or there was another parent that believed very, very strongly that children should stay away from the RSS. There was a ton of overt dislike for this organization. And so that continued, and then you see the political movement in the 1980s. But I think there's a lot happening under the surface as well. I'm not really sure if, when we talk about, we've given it a name in the book. It's the RSS, it's communalism and all of these things. But say you take the organization away, you have a certain conservatism, a certain sort of way of thinking, which I think people may recognize. It's the sort of view that looks askance at, say, a Muslim tenant coming into a building for the first time, or somebody cooking non-veg, something like that. That sort of thing, it was very much present all this time. It's not like it went away and we became a completely secular society. You also see the riots that pop up from time to time, and you see these pots bubbling all over the place. And then, of course, you've got the big one in the 1990s.
Because the way somebody explained this to me, they said what happened in the 90s, and unlike the book, which actually goes back all the way to the origins, I think our institutional memory is kind of Hindutva kind of begins and ends in the late 80s, early 90s. The way somebody explained it to me, they said, it's not that we weren't bigoted. It is not that bigotry didn't exist in us. It is just that that moment, or those few years, gave permission for bigots to be bigots overtly, to be performative bigots, if you like. And the example he used was, it's not that the white American Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP community is not bigoted. It's just that when Trump comes down that escalator and calls Mexicans rapists, he's giving permission for you to actually voice your bigotry. And the same way, when we talk about the Guspetia, when we talk about, Hindu खतरे में hai. Mohan Bhagwat talked about it today. I think he says Hindu society has to unite in order to protect itself. He was probably in a hurry. He forgot to tell us what we are supposed to protect ourselves from. But yeah, that's a statement from.
I actually laughed out loud when I read that, because in the book I sort of mentioned there was this document I'd found. B.S. Munje, who was with the Mahasabha, one of the senior leaders of the Mahasabha, in 1931, he goes and meets Mussolini, and he says, we've got to have this discipline, all of these things. We've got to have a school that teaches us how to sort of use arms and all of that other stuff. He was a big one for Hindu khatre mein hai, and everybody has to come together, unity. But in one of his letters, he writes somewhere that we need the lower castes to join our numbers because they can provide the muscle to fight Muslims. And I think about that a lot, about the role that lower castes, lowered castes would play in this imagination of a unified Hinduism.
You brought up Advani and his connection with how the Aadhaar project originated and then morphed into what it is today. I wanted you to explain that a little bit more, because there are lots of it that were new to me. Not necessarily about how Aadhaar came into being during the UPA years, but the backstory behind that. But I also wanted to ask you a related question. You've spent time with people who knew Advani well and who worked closely with Advani, including somebody who still works closely with him as his personal assistant and sort of pretty much the only regular visitor Advani has. In any of these interactions, did you get the feeling that maybe with the passage of time, Advani got a sense that he might have released a genie out of a bottle that he could no longer put back in the bottle? Was there any sense of maybe a rethink, maybe remorse?
No. What's the opposite of remorse? No, it's so when I was speaking to his PA, I was there to talk to him about Aadhaar and how it may have happened, and this identification project that he was so deeply invested in at that point. And I asked him about the violence around the Rath Yatra. His PA was also one of the planners of his election campaigns and joined him and went along on these Rath Yatras with him, on the Rath Yatra with him. He was talking about how passionate people were everywhere they went. It's like they believed in the cause. And whether they got to a town at 2 or 3 in the morning, there would be people lined up, crouching on the sides of the road as the yatra went by. And he was talking about passion. And I said, but there was also violence at that. And there were incendiary speeches and those kinds of things. And he said to me, I write in the book, I'm paraphrasing over here. He said to me that there is always sort of, there are people who will cause mischief around these events. People are passionate, and so somebody says something, but nothing came from Advani. And when I walked out of that interview, I thought about what it means to be present when things are said that are about to spark off violence, and then remember these moments as something that just happened, or at least telling me that it just happened, that we didn't have anything to do with this, that Advani had nothing to do with this. It was the people around, and there were other people who were passionate about this. So, I remember the look on his face. I wrote about it. You meet a lot of people, and you encounter a lot of situations as a reporter, but the look where it was like, it's one of those things that happens, that stayed with me. And I think I am a little disturbed. I am a little disturbed by that. Sometimes we think in binaries, like a person who riots is a bad guy. But when you go meet them in their environment, they're actually, if you talk to people around them, they're pretty upstanding citizens. I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but for a number of people, they're doing pretty remarkable things by any parameter. The person I'm sort of referring to over here is head of Thalassemics India. And while I was there were all these letters on his desk asking for medicines and blood transfusions and everything. And he was facilitating these things 30 years down the line. But there is that one thing that bothers me. So with that out of the way, I want to talk about Advani and the identification project itself. Now, I went and met A.S. Dulat, who was with the research and analysis wing, and I met a bunch of other people who were in the room with Advani and various other government officials and administrators as these plans were being formed. And it was clear to the people there that they wanted an identification project that would identify foreigners. But the card, and they were seeing it as a card at that point, had to do more than just identify a person. In fact, Advani at one point is sitting at the back of a car waving around a social security card. His brother in law, I think, is in the States. And he comes down, shows him the social security number, the card, and he says, "Why don't we have something like this?" And he starts thinking about it. And somewhere along the way, there are many other things that are going on. You've got World Bank visitors coming in. The idea of a smart card is sort of spreading around the world, a chip in a card that can hold a certain amount of data. And you see these various things come together. And at some point, as companies are winding down their preparation for Y2K, you remember that? They needed an enormous amount of processing power. At that point, they're looking for the next big thing to do. And for a few companies, the eye is on the census. But when they go meet the people in charge of the census, they find them completely unresponsive. And the guys in charge of the census tell them, listen, there's another project that's coming up somewhere else. It's about an identification card. Maybe you should think about that. So you see the emergence of these ideas. An identification card is coming. Advani is talking about infiltrators when he goes to Assam. The literature that is given to people who are bidding for this project, it's essentially, there was a Mughal invasion. These are the sort of documents they're being given officially. There was a Mughal invasion, and since then we have had a problem, and this is a way of rooting out infiltrators and all of that stuff. And there's a subtext also. So you have these consultants from various companies, Infosys, TCS, a bunch of others. They're going to these meetings and they're hearing bureaucrats talk about infiltrators. And at a certain point, as they're deciding what this card can do, at a certain point, somebody paraphrased it for me. They said, the thinking went, the carrot for all of this should be welfare. And that put me in mind of Aadhaar. And I asked this person, can you show me what the architecture of your system was like? And he pulled out the story and he explained some graphics that had been published by this magazine. And there were pillars, they were connected to a joint number and identity. And these people would be enrolled in decentralized cells across the country. And it felt very familiar. And I said, this feels a lot like Aadhaar. And he said, yeah, it does feel a lot like Aadhaar. And when I spoke to 4 or 5 other people and asked them the same question, do you think Aadhaar is what that was? Your identification project is what became Aadhaar? They were pretty certain that that was the case. Well, they felt like there were certainly striking resemblances between these things.
That's one hell of a lot to unpack. One of the things that struck me again when I was reading a book, and it got reinforced this morning with a phone call. For some reason, I think people have lost trust in psephologists, so they just call random numbers and say, what's going to happen in Haryana? That's, yeah, well, I mean, I haven't been to Haryana in about 5 years. But that aside, the thing is, I notice, and I'm guilty to an extent about this as well, we tend to look at Hindutva, the identity project, as you call it, your strapline says, the unmaking of a democracy. We tend to see this in political terms. So riots, hate speech, the various jihads, what is it? This land jihad, thuk jihad, love jihad. I don't know, I mean, pretty much you add jihad to anything that you don't like. And in the middle of all this, we do a calculus. Is this going to help the BJP or is it not? In Jharkhand right now, they're talking about Muslim infiltrators because Jharkhand elections are coming up. What struck me when reading one particular section of your book is that maybe we're looking at it from the wrong lens. Maybe the identity project needs to be looked at from the lens of society and of our institutions. That while we see the political gives and gets, the ups and downs of the political arm of the Hindutva family, what we're not looking at is the systematic capture of these institutions. There is a character in your book. He's a VHP lawyer who does pro bono work for those who have been charged in the Delhi riots. Apparently, were you the one who told me 11 of them have been freed of all charges today for want of evidence? And the point where I sat up and took notice was when when he talks about his work and how it's important and why it's necessary to do it, even though he's not earning any money for it. And then he very casually says, in a very matter of fact tone, that he wants his children to grow up and become high court judges. This is the essence of the project, isn't it? Gradual infiltration of hardcore believers into the courts, into the police forces, into the army, into the administrative services.
So I think researching for this book was such an eye-opening experience for me, because I don't know how you guys look at what's happening in the country around us, but they don't seem like random events once you start looking at history and you start seeing certain patterns emerge and recur over time, over the decades. One day, I was sitting at a library looking at intelligence reports, again from 1947. I'll go there again because for me, that was a massive moment where I started to think that, my goodness, this is actually pretty big. There's a point at which police are getting these tips that there are store of ammunition and a printing press in a particular house that is publishing incendiary literature. And they write a post-raid report that we got there as soon as we got the tip. But when we got there, the place was emptied out. People had moved out within a few minutes, within a few minutes before we got there. And I just stored it at the back of my head, as one does when you're dealing with a tremendous amount of information. And somewhere down the line, I found another report where they found that the exchanges through which information was being passed was filled with people who were leaking messages that the police were sending to each other. So, in many cases, messages that the police were sending each other about raids, like raid that house or go there, was being leaked to people who were inside those houses. And I thought about it, what that meant. Then there was another document at some point that said, we've got to get our own people into this exchange because it's filled with people who are sympathetic to the cause of Hindutva. They didn't use those exact words. Again, I'm paraphrasing. Then you see letters, like these desperate letters after Gandhi's murder, where people are writing to inspectors saying, listen, you've got to change your interrogators in this jail because they are related to the people they are interrogating. And they happen to be members of this group that is accused of killing him. Can you do something? You see these kinds of patterns emerge. You see Nehru struggling to understand why those vacant positions, those positions that were left vacant after Muslims en masse left and went to Pakistan, why they were being filled with people who were sympathetic to Hindutva. You see him struggling with all of that. And so when you step back and you look at it over a period of time and you look at things the way they are today, you realize that it is institutional. And I think requiring, understanding where we are today as a country and the nature of what you're dealing with, you realize that it's not political. Political aspect, or when, at times of this political ascendancy, I think now, I'm coming around to believing this, that at times when they're politically ascendant, you see a certain acceleration in the positions they occupy within government, the kind of literature that comes out, the movies that come out. But when they're not on the ascendant, it's not like they've disappeared. It's just the political party whose fortunes are a little, subdued at that point in time. The rest of it is pretty active. The schools are active, the daycare centers are active, the shakhas are continuing morning, noon, and night. Police, sort of people keep rising up the ranks of police, the army, and various other places. And then, of course, I met this this lawyer for the VHP, as you mentioned, and he says in a very matter-of-fact way that, yeah, he had dreams too. And he said, yeah, someday in the future, my children will join the judiciary and they go to shakhas. They have the same education that I have had. You wonder.
The characters that you write about, there's somebody who lost his eye in the Jamia library when the police action happened. There is a gay Muslim who hides his identity. There is another Muslim character who was again caught up in the riots. And unlike the others, he insists that he is going to file an FIR, and not just the standard no persons mentioned FIR, but one that names names. The VHP lawyer, you've talked to Advani's PA, you've attended a shaka and actually participated in those exercises or whatever. What I wanted to ask you is, how do you build that trust? Because it takes a great deal of trust before people will open up the way they have in your book. How does a reporter go about doing that?
I set aside my skepticism with everybody and just went to them openly, explained exactly what I wanted to do. With people who've been afflicted by some kind of trauma, you have to be gentle and you've got to approach them through people they know. So it took a long time. In many cases, if they wouldn't talk to me, I would send them. I said, look, just take a look at my work in the past. And I would send them my long stories for the Caravan or something I had done for Guardian or whichever publication. And because I knew that, my life up to that point, there were certain themes that I had been exploring. And I felt that when I talk to people, they're always an example of the kind of work I want to do and want to continue doing, which is talking about people who haven't received justice. So I would do things like that. I would go back over and over again and keep visiting them, sometimes alone, sometimes with an intermediary who was trusted, and they would speak for me. They would vouch for me, sorry. So these were the sort of things that I was doing. And I, look, there's no way around it. If you really want to try and understand what's happening in this country, you're going to have to talk to people who are a part of history. You have to talk to the people who are rioting, who are allegedly rioting, the lawyers, the cops, the victims. You've got to speak to everybody. It's unavoidable. I mean, if you don't do that, you're not really getting a comprehensive picture. And I wanted a comprehensive picture, which I think I did about 400 or 500 interviews. I interviewed about 300 people for the book. And many of these people I went back to over and over and over again, amassing an enormous amount of sort of these interview transcripts. Some people I interviewed about 12, 13 times. This book was actually much, much bigger before I cut it down to 400 pages. But I think it was closer to about 250,000 words at some point. Yeah. I don't recommend it.
What Rahul was talking about, some of us knew that he was working on this or a book on these lines for any time in the last 6 years. Every 6 months or so, one of us would message him saying, okay, when's the book coming out? And we've been doing that religiously for about 6 years. And so, yeah, that speaks to the volume of the work. But a related question is, it's a complex subject. It's considering that all of this, as you say in your introduction, the initial thought stemmed from your own personal close encounters with bigotry, even within your own circle. The contents of the book and the kind of research that you've done over these 6 years, deeply complex subject, deep immersion. I was wondering, does that kind of thing change you as both a reporter and a person? If so, how?
I think on a number of levels, it does change you. One is when you see complexity like that, and I'm always attracted to complex stories. The more complicated, the better, because it gives me a lot more to sort of sink my teeth into. So I like that. When you see that kind of complexity and you grapple with it, I just told you that the book was about, maybe twice the size of this thing. What I didn't say was that the archival material, the interviews, all the stuff that went into, every fact in the book, that was, I don't know, it's about 100 gigabytes or something like that. It's just thousands and thousands of documents. So when you deal with something like that, you don't ever want to do simplicity again, because you know how rewarding it can be at a certain point once you've grappled with that kind of complexity. So that's one. So I'm never working for a newspaper again. As soon as it was done, I started thinking, okay, what do I do next? And should it be simple or should it be complicated? The answer was complicated. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, I think sometimes I'm still grappling with it. You go back again and again and again. I'll give you the example of East Delhi. I went and interviewed guys who'd lost their eyes, who'd witnessed, religious leaders being killed, and their houses had been burnt down. And I would walk around these lanes with them, and they would remember things as we were talking, as we were walking down. They would remember how things used to be. They would remember what things were like when they were younger and they had moved to this neighborhood for the first time. And you hear that betrayal. And somewhere you, as a reporter, you're trying not to think about it. You are trying to be as dispassionate as you can. You're trying to also at the same time empathize with them, because that builds trust. And you're going back over and over again. You're meeting their families, you're meeting their wives, their children, and you see the lives they live, and it gets to you at a point. Look, I have it easy. There's a home I go back to in Bombay. I don't have to live there. But when you go there, you start becoming aware after a certain point in time that there is a certain intractable nature to these problems that they're facing. And these problems are intractable because there is something happening, or something has happened in society that is allowing, or rather that gives the police the permission to behave a certain way. It may be judges who say a certain thing. It may be politicians who who speak of Muslims a certain way. It may just be relatives. It seems to be really widespread. And I think for me, I sometimes these days I don't have that manic last minute editing and writing and figuring out the structure to do. So I have a lot of time on my hands. And sometimes when I'm just sitting by myself, I don't know how to deal with what I've seen. So I know that it's changed me in some ways. I also know I'm more aware of my own good fortune. I know that I'm a very privileged person, that I can walk into a situation like that and I can walk out, that I can throw my weight around with cops, and I don't have to listen to what they say all the time. I can throw a little attitude, but not everybody has that option available to them. I think this is a really complicated country, and I think one of the byproducts of that is I've started looking at Western coverage of India with a really sort of sideways glance, basically. Like that's a little too simple for this country. There's a lot more going on than we all know, and there's what you read in the papers, and then there are those systems that exist outside the papers that where the sausage is really made. I think I saw a bit of that sausage factory, and it was pretty disturbing. So.
Yeah, there's a meme going around on social media. India isn't easy. That's true.
Not for beginners.
Yeah, not for beginners. Yeah. India isn't easy. I plagiarized from, I think, the American president, Michael Douglas's last speech, where he says, "America isn't easy." It's spot on. The line that I distinctly remember is, he says, "My opponent is interested only in two things. One is to make you afraid of it, and two is to tell you who's to blame for it. And that it could be anything from Mexican rapists to Hindu Katrine."
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.